Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teacher Development Webinars. My name is Amanullah Sand. I facilitate virtual programs at the Teacher Development Webinars. Teacher Development Webinars is a social action project to support teachers and educators around the world with professional development opportunities. It is an initiative using the rise in online professional development to connect people from around the world with opportunities which they may not have had due to the old normal of face-to-face conferences. And now it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Anne Burns for this webinar. Professor Anne Burns is a part-time professor at Curtin University, Australia, and honorary professor of TESOL at the University of New South Wales, Sydney, and Professor Emerita in Language Education at Aston University, Birmingham, UK. She is also an honorary professor at the University of Sydney and the Education University, Hong Kong. She has published extensively on action research and teacher education and supervised many doctoral students conducting research on English language teaching and learning. Her most recent books are the Cambridge Guide to Learning English as a Second Language, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, edited with Professor Jack Richards, and Sustaining Action Research, published by Routledge in 2022, co-authored with Dr. Emily Edwards and Dr. Neville Ellis. Thank you very much for development.
Hello, good morning, everybody.
Right. So can everyone see Professor slides? Do you see?
Are you able to make them a little bit larger?
Yes, I've made it in the full screen mode.
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Okay, shall I begin? Thank
Sure.
you very much for that very welcoming introduction. I really appreciate it. And it's wonderful to be here. I know you can see that there are people coming from many different places. So it's really exciting to know that people are listening in from so many different countries, including Pakistan. So just to tell you a little bit about where I am, perhaps we can start pressing. I'm here in Australia, in Perth, and you can see a couple of photographs there at the top of the kind of location that I'm currently in. Perth is quite a big city in Western Australia, and it's situated on a beautiful river, the Swan River, and quite near the ocean. So it's a wonderful place to be able to go out into nature and also to swim at the beach and so on. It's a very, very pleasant area to be in. But I'm very excited to say that I've also had an opportunity in the past to visit Pakistan, and that was a few years ago, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. I came for one of the conferences there, and I had an opportunity to go to different cities in Pakistan and meet many teachers in your beautiful country, and to see many beautiful things that are very exciting to visit. So it's wonderful to think that I'm connecting with an organization in Pakistan, and also with so many different teachers from different countries. So welcome, everybody. Well, let's get started. The topic I'm going to be talking about this morning is to link the idea of teaching speaking with possibilities to do action research within that topic. So let me begin by talking a little bit about speaking, or oracy. And this is a topic which many teachers are very interested in their classrooms, because we often wonder and perhaps worry even about how to get our students to communicate and to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what speaking consists of and some possible general approaches that we could adopt in teaching it. So it's true to say a few things about speaking, first of all. First of all, it is a complex and dynamic skill. And the reason that it's complex and dynamic is because speaking involves using quite a lot of different processes all at the same time. And not only that, we have to do it in real time. So when we speak in any language at all, we're drawing on several processes. The cognitive processes, that is, our brain has to think very quickly about what to say and so on. We also have to have physical abilities in pronouncing words and articulating our mouths and our vocal organs in order to produce the speech. But also we have to be very sensitive to cultural and social factors and the kinds of things that it might be appropriate to say in different situations. Let's move on to the next point, where we can also say that it's challenging. When anybody who's learned another language will know that speaking is perhaps one of the most challenging things that you have to do in learning a language, because our knowledge of the language and our skills in using that language have to be activated extremely quickly in real time, in authentic situations, if we're going to be able to say anything and communicate about it at all. So it is a challenging skill to learn, and it's unlike written skills, reading or writing. We don't have time to think about what we're writing or saying. So my argument, therefore, is that it's very important for teachers to know what speaking consists of and about these different skills in order to be able to teach it explicitly in the classroom. And another argument of mine, if we can get the next point, is that that we can't just rest on the idea that doing a lot of speaking activities in the classroom will automatically lead students to be able to speak. So just doing speaking activities, I would argue, it's not the same as teaching explicitly the knowledge and the skills of speaking. And I want to elaborate on that idea a little bit by taking you inside a classroom where a teacher is using some speaking activities. So let's move on and have a look at this classroom on the next slide. So just as I'm speaking, keep thinking about what I'm saying about this teacher in her classroom and whether you think she's doing speaking or teaching speaking in the way that I was just describing it. So we'll call her teacher M, and she believed it was important to develop her students' speaking abilities. Of course, most teachers feel that that's a very important aspect to their classroom. And next point. Just waiting for the next point to come up. If you can press. Thank you. So what she was very keen to do is to make sure that her students had plenty of opportunities in the classroom to communicate with one another. What she did was there were 2 lessons a week for speaking practice, and she was a very conscientious teacher who planned interesting activities for her students. So let's go on to what happened next in her classroom. So as you can see, she was planning very carefully, and she had objectives around the instruction that she wanted to give the students. And these objectives came in the form of what she thought the students should produce. And that could be a presentation or a debate or descriptions or something, and what she thought that they had to do. So did they have to discuss a topic, or did they have to narrate or tell a story, or did they have to role play in some way? So she had these ideas at the back of her mind. Let's go on. Next slide. Next slide, please. Can you? Yes. So, so she had these two ideas, as I said, and sometimes when the students had, no, back to the last slide. Okay, so sometimes when they'd finished the activities, this is what she would do. She would ask the students to present the outcomes to the whole class. And other times she would just move on to another activity, such as a reading activity or a writing activity. Okay, I want to go on now, move on to the next one, and to ask you in the audience, what do you think about the description of this class? What are your views? What are the pros? What do you think are the advantages or the pros of the teacher's approach? And what do you think could be the disadvantages or the cons of the teacher's approach? And you might want to put some things into the chat box to let me see what your views might be. I'll give you a minute or two to think about it. And any comments, if you have any comments, put them into the chat box. Yeah, so Mark is saying feedback and reflection. So I think that that's a very important point. Some reflection on what they had done on the part of the learners. It's very, very useful. Any other comments at all? Oh dear, seem to have lost the slides now.
Can you see them?
No. Yeah, that's right. That's good. Okay, so I think Mohammed is saying some textual study. Yeah, it's quite important to know what kind of text you're dealing with as a speaker. Is it some kind of conversation, or is it just general chit chat? What is the nature of the text? Conversations and presentations are different. Exactly, Fatima is saying they're not quite the same type of interaction. Quite right. Another couple of comments, perhaps, before we go on. Any other thoughts? Yes, identifying the genre. This is kind of where we've been getting to, isn't it? To think about what kind of genre is it that is involved in the activity that you're teaching. And that's very important. Any other points at all?
Nidata Basum says background and context of audience is necessary to know.
Yeah, the context, the audience, who it is that you're speaking to, what is appropriate to say in that particular context, and the nature of the conversation. All right, let's move on to the next slide then. And here I've tried to summarize some of the things that could be the pros and the cons of the speaking in this teacher's classroom, and some have already been mentioned. So the pros, well, the good thing is that this teacher was very active in having a variety of activities, and it was clear that the students enjoyed interacting in the classroom. And she was certainly giving them opportunities to practice speaking through these different approaches that she took. And some opportunities to present the outcomes, although that was not always very systematic in the way that it was carried out. But on the other hand, the cons or the disadvantages could be that there wasn't really any or very little preparation for practicing specific skills. So it was a general activity, but it wasn't clear that the teacher was targeting a specific skill that the students could take forward. So there wasn't much explicit teaching of key areas of speaking. And they weren't really paying much attention to knowledge, skills, and strategy development. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. And she wasn't, she certainly, as somebody already mentioned, she wasn't giving very much feedback on the students' performance. So it was hard for the students to know where to go next, because there wasn't too much follow-up on the activities that the students could take away from that experience. So while there were good things happening, there was some things missing that perhaps could have been taken a bit further. So I want to talk a little bit more about the skills that I think as teachers we need to pay attention to at different times when we're focusing on the teaching of speaking. So next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about speaking as a three-part competence. And this comes from a book that I wrote some time ago with Christine Go. And Christine and I argued that speaking competence is what we can call combinatorial. In other words, it combines different aspects of the skill of speaking that need to be explicitly taught in the classroom at different times. So first of all, there's knowledge of language and discourse, and somebody has already mentioned the idea of genre, text, and we certainly need to give students a sense of what kinds of texts we're engaging them in. Also, we need to help students with the core speaking skills. What are they and how can we help to develop them? And the third thing that we need to help them with is strategies for communicating, and to explicitly know about those strategies so that they can draw on them as they go along. Let's take each of those in turn and look at them a little bit more carefully in the next slide. So I'm going to talk first of all in the next slide of language and discourse. If we can bring that slide up now. Okay, so language and discourse, what is the essential thing about this that we need to help our students with? So this is to do with mastering sound patterns, of course. We have to be able to help them with pronunciation. So we must know a little bit about segmental and suprasegmental aspects of pronunciation and how students can be helped with that. So segmental, looking at stress patterns, individual word stress patterns, but suprasegmental, looking at stress patterns over chunks of language and knowing how to handle those. Developing knowledge of the grammar and vocabulary. So we need to help students with spoken structures and grammar and the features of grammar and vocabulary also. To be able to speak, you have to have quite a large vocabulary. So we need to do quite a bit of specific vocabulary development with them. And also, I think developing the knowledge of grammar and vocabulary involves introducing students, particularly at the beginning, to language chunks or prefabricated forms of language, which are already fixed forms, which they can use, like greetings. How do people greet each other in a particular language, for example? These are not things we invent from scratch. They're fixed ways of introducing ourselves or greeting people. And then also understanding how stretches of speech are connected, the discourse and the genre that people have referred to. Let's go on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the typical genres that we can find in speaking, first of all. So one very common genre in speech is, and we do this all the time, any native speaker of any language will use these kinds of genres in their speech patterns. It doesn't matter whether it's English or other things. So one thing that people do a lot, that human beings do a lot through speech, is telling stories about their experiences. Our everyday experiences of life, what's happened to us, what unusual things might have happened, how we faced a problem and resolved that problem. These are different forms of narratives that we tell in different languages. The other thing that we quite often do is we tell anecdotes, and we can distinguish that by saying that this would be a remarkable event, something that really, really out of the ordinary, you know, guess what happened to me? And it's something that you wouldn't have expected or that you experienced, which was unusual or out of the ordinary. Another thing we do is a recount, and that means telling sequences of events. So different stages in the event that occurred. I went to the cinema, I saw a movie, I bought some food to eat in the cinema, you know, the events as they unfolded over time, which is a little bit different from solving a problem or having something unusual happening. And then the last one, which is a little bit more unusual to know about, perhaps, is that we often tell stories to make a social point about society or people that we deal with. And these kinds of stories reflect our beliefs, really, about how the world should behave, or how people in the world should behave towards each other. So they have a kind of a moral point or an ethical standpoint, reflecting the way that we think that things should happen to us, which are moral or ethical ways of behaving. Right, let's go on. So these are very common genres in speech, and we can help our students unpack these genres by just telling them about how they operate and looking at examples of them to show them how they can participate in those kinds of genres. Okay, I'm going very quickly on here because we don't have too much time, but we can also talk about the core skills we need for speaking competence. And these are several other ones. So I've already spoken about the ability to speak fluently. So we need fluency, but we also need accuracy when we speak. But fluency is to do with developing formulaic language, the chunks of language that I was talking about that are not original. It's things like, oh, how do you feel today? Or what are you doing at the weekend? You know, things that we don't have to invent from the beginning, but which come in chunks that are very familiar in those languages. And the rate of speech also is important, because if we speak too slowly or too hesitantly, then people will not be able to communicate with us. So we have to help students with increasing their fluency, chunking and pausing their speech in ways that make the speech logical and understandable for other people. And we also have to know how to negotiate speech, you know, how to take turns in speech patterns, in a conversation, in some kind of discussion, because it's not the case that if you're in a conversation, you hold the floor all the time. You have to ask other people or invite other people or let other people into the conversation. So we have to know how to do that and how to take play our part and take our turns in speech as it unfolds. So here we have to do things like knowing how to build on previous utterances that other people have made, or we have to be able to repair communication when it breaks down. If people haven't understood us, we have to find a way to explain what we mean by perhaps using other phrases or other expressions or vocabulary. And we've also got to be able to manage the flow of speech. We have to know how to open a conversation, close a conversation. What do you do to start things off or to take your leave from the conversation when it's finishing? Initiating topics, changing the topic to something new, taking turns, and also signaling your intention to speak, that you would like to get into the conversation and have a turn. Okay, and we'll go on to the third area of speaking competence. And these are communication strategies. So these are things like cognitive strategies, knowing how to paraphrase things, having a sense of what gestures are appropriate in the language that you're speaking, knowing how to, if you can't quite get the right vocabulary or you can't remember the exact way to say something, you have to be able to say it in another way, and that's called approximation. So getting as close to the meaning as possible, or avoiding things and using other expressions if you're not quite sure how to say it. So these are the cognitive strategies, which are to do with really thinking very, very quickly on our feet and using the language resources that we have available to us already, whatever level those might be in the language. Then we also have to draw on metacognitive strategies. So in other words, this is planning in advance what to say. And in speaking, that can be very useful for students, because it's very confronting if they have to suddenly say something without any preparation beforehand or without any way of practicing what they're going to say in advance, and also helping them to notice how to say things, what kinds of phrases or vocabulary or expressions are used to talk about different topics. And that's where perhaps the formulaic expressions come in as well. And also interaction strategies like being able to, as the conversation or the discussion or presentation is going on, being able to clarify things or repeat some information, rephrase things, or check that other people have understood you and that they're following you in what you're trying to say. Okay, so I've gone very, very quickly over some of the core competencies in speaking, and hopefully that breaks down a little bit the different areas that we can possibly focus on as teachers, that combinatorial area. So what I'm saying is not that we have to teach all of these all the time, but we may as teachers want to select certain skills and competencies that we feel the students still need to practice and are still lacking and need further development. So I want to present you also from the book that Christine and I wrote with a sort of a framework for teaching speaking that can focus on different skills and bring in different activities that you could bring in. So the first step in this speaking cycle is to focus the students' attention on speaking, and that might even be speaking on a certain topic. So you may want to start off even perhaps using L1 to begin with, on what the students already know about this topic. How much have they experienced it? Have they encountered it before? Is it something that they have the vocabulary for? So that might even be just a sort of preparation stage where you're just preparing them or pre-teaching something so that they've got the ability and skills to go on. And then you might provide, as part of that, some input and guided planning. So that might be to do with pre-teaching vocabulary or showing students the kind of models of a genre that people could follow, giving them some structure to help them to be successful. And then you would give them a speaking task. So this is where they're sort of on their own, if you like, using whatever resources they've got to be able to do that task. So you introduce them to an activity or a task that you want to use in the classroom and get them to perform that task and see how they go. So this is where an important part of the teacher's role comes in, because you really need to be monitoring what they're saying and how they're reacting to the task in order to help feed forward into their future improvement of that speaking skill. And then we're going to, after that, focus on the language skills and strategy. So as they're doing the task, you may have noticed that some things were not being very well said or very well performed in that task. And for you as a teacher, that's very useful, because it may be something you want to reteach and help them to achieve more effectively. Then you might repeat the speaking task after a period of some explicit further teaching of the skills, get the students to do the task again so that they get another chance to rehearse it and try it out and reuse what they've learned in the same task, so that it's helping them to consolidate what they know and about being able to perform that task. And then you might want to direct attention to their reflections. And I noticed earlier somebody in the chat mentioned the reflections and the on learning and the feedback that's involved in that. This is an important aspect of helping them to particularly notice what's happened in their own performance and to absorb that so that they can improve into the future. And facilitating feedback on their learning, which may mean giving them some more formal feedback from you as the teacher, some evaluation of their performance perhaps, or it may be that you are interested in peer evaluation and you can get the students to comment on each other's performance in that particular task, so that they're helping each other and scaffolding each other's learning as well. So this is just a general framework that you can possibly use for thinking about the teaching of some of your activities. I'll just go on to the next slide now and perhaps elaborate a little bit more on all of this. So you can see the stages of the cycle. Just really just go up a bit. Can you press again, please, on the slide? It's very unclear. Yes. So focusing attention on the speaking, getting them to think about what they believe and know. And then the second one, providing the input, guided planning, conducting the speaking tasks, and then focusing again on the skills and strategies and repeating the task and directing the students' reflections on their learning and facilitating feedback on their learning. So this is just repeating what I said before in relation to the cycle and putting it into the stages, the step-by-step stages of the cycle. Okay. Can I get just quickly any comments on whether, before we go on to that one, can you go back, please? Last slide. Last slide, please. Okay, are there any comments just at this point on any of what I've said so far? Because I'm going to go on now to talk a bit more about action research.
Dr. Ghulam Ali Guru from University of Sindh says, a pretty insightful session. Thank you very much, Professor N and Mr. Amanullah. And Julio says, hello from Cesar Baca from Honduras. Thank you very much for your attention and invitation. I'm glad to attend it. Muhammad Zunaid says, I think very good for the people who have some weakness in speaking and listening.
Okay, yes, and I can see Dr. Ghulam is saying feedback stage, yes, it's important in these activities. Reflection, yes, thank you, Natasha. That's quite right. Providing useful discussion skills, yes, thank you, Samikisha. Sorry about the pronunciation if I haven't got it right. And providing that feedback. Yes, very, very nice comments. Any other comments for just a minute or two? Debate, yes. Introducing a debate for the students can be really useful, and then you can focus their attention on some of the skills that they need in order to conduct a debate, or even, you know, if they've experienced a debate before, repeating the task. Yes, I thank you, Yang Wang, for that comment, because I do really believe that in classrooms we often don't repeat the tasks enough. So students are given a task and then we move on to something else rather quickly without giving them a chance to rehearse it again. And their willingness to speak is important. And perhaps that's something that we can talk to them explicitly about, because as teachers of English, we've ourselves have experienced the challenges of learning another language. And so we can share those experiences with the students and show that we understand that it's not easy to learn how to speak another language. I'm currently learning another language myself, and I just realized how hard it is and how much you have to practice the language in order to be able to speak it effectively. It is very challenging. So we can share those experiences with our students too. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to move over towards talking about action research a little bit now, because I think the topic of speaking really lends itself very much to the idea of being able to do some research in your classroom and investigate some of the things that your students are experiencing, and also perhaps looking at whether we as teachers can understand our practices a little bit more, and also perhaps carry out some investigations on those practices that will help us to improve. So action research, I would say, is a great motivator for research. Action in the classroom motivates and can be a great motivator for doing research ourselves. Just very briefly, the idea of action research goes back to the early part of the last century, and Kurt Lewin was one of the main founders, if you like, of action research. And I really like some of the things that he said about the idea of action research. He was a man who said that research that produces nothing but books will not suffice. So he believed that it was very important for research to have a practical outcome, an outcome of action that people could use in their daily lives or in their work or in their professions or in their communities. It wasn't just, in his view, restricted to education, but it was something, research that people could bring back into their own activities for increasing their own agency to do those activities. And he also said there's nothing as practical as a good theory, and the best way to understand something is to change it. So he also hinted or talked about the idea that research should enable people to change the way that they do things. And that is really at the heart or the core of action research, if you like. And we'll go on and talk a bit more now about action research itself, as it may not be completely familiar to you. So could you press some more of the down arrow, please? And there'll be some other points that come up. So this is a model that I've used a lot around action research. It's not the only model, and I wouldn't say it's a perfect model or an ideal model, but it's a practical model. And I like it for that reason, because it captures some of the key areas or the key steps, if you like, in doing action research. So this is a model that was devised by Kemmis and McTaggart quite a long time ago in the 1980s. And they proposed that their model consisted of 4 steps. So they said we should plan, we should act, we should observe, and we should reflect. And we could keep going round that cycle several times, as many times as we would like to, according to the type of research that we were doing and according to how much we were discovering about our own practices from the research itself. So it's what we might call a dynamic model or an iterative model, one that keeps going round and can be used several times over. It spirals. And just to talk about the steps a bit more, so to plan, that means to identify something in your classroom which you're interested in and to form a kind of plan to explore it more deeply. So we're talking about the topic of speaking. And so the topic you might be interested in is to do with how your students are learning to speak in the classroom, and a challenge or an issue or a puzzle that you might have noticed around that and around your students' practices or your own practices. And then we would go on from there to act on that plan. So we would put it into action in the classroom to try and change or modify what we're doing in some way. And this is where the research part comes in, because so far I've really been talking about action, but to bring in the research part of it, we need to observe what happens. So to do that, we need some evidence about what's happening as a result of these different approaches. And we need to collect some data or evidence. That could be in the form of some surveys or interviews or observations, a lot of different ways to collect the data. And then throughout the whole process, we would reflect on what's happening. And that reflection would include thinking about, well, is this going the way that I thought it was going to go, or do I need to modify it or change it in some way so that I can improve it even further? So reflection is not really just at the end of the process. I think it comes in right from the beginning when you start to plan, because you can be constantly looking at what's happening as a result of what you're doing in the classroom as you go along. Okay, let's go to the next slide. That's it. So this is a new form, a relatively new form of research, and one that is still finding its feet in many different contexts, but it's becoming increasingly popular. In the last 20 or 30 years, I've really noticed in the work that I've been doing in the field of English language teaching, people are really looking much more now to action research, and particularly when it comes to teacher education, professional development, teacher training, and so on. It's seen as a way to help teachers increase their ability to reflect on the classroom, what's happening, and their own practices. So it's really just only emerged quite strongly over the last 30, 40 years, you might say. And you might find different terminology used. There's lots of different terms that are used to do with this idea of professional learning. So you can see some of them there. I won't read them all out, but you can see the different ways of describing this process are quite often used. I like the one action research because I think it acknowledges that teachers are very competent practitioners who can certainly investigate and do research in the classroom. And I feel that that would democratize the idea of research a lot more than perhaps the way we've viewed research in the past. So I'm quite keen on the idea of action research. However, whichever term that you decide to use, this is it's all still to do with seeing research as something that's done by practitioners in various different professions, including teaching profession, on their own practices. So this kind of research is what we would call insider research. Insider meaning that you're a researcher, but you're also the person who's engaged in the classroom every day as part of your own professional life. And that's in contrast with outsider research, where academic researchers might go into teachers' classrooms and observe what they do, but those teachers are not necessarily part of the research itself. Okay, let's move on a little bit. And I think I like this quote from Mann, who says that, and I believe this too, if a teacher is able to stay in their teaching context, and their work is enriched by reading, reflective teaching, and action research, the experience usually leads to sustained development. So I'm a very, very strong advocate for teachers doing this kind of work, reading, reflective teaching, action research as their professional development, in contrast to presentations which may not have too much relevance to your own classroom. When you do this kind of research, you're making the topics and the way that you look at the classroom extremely appropriate and related to your own teaching context. And the discoveries that come out of it can be very much related to your teaching, your work, your students, and so on. So we'll move on. And I was once at a conference in Turkey, and this is a comment made by a teacher researcher about the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And this teacher was very keen on action research too. She'd participated in it. She thought it was a very useful professional development for herself. And then she said, I don't think one-shot seminars are beneficial. Educational programs should be conducted in our own context. Sometimes we join one-day seminars for a plenary speaker or a raffle only. I took a lot of notes until now. However, only very little is relevant to me. A teacher development program should be long-term, interactive, and suitable to our needs. And one of my arguments is that when you engage in action research, you find that it is very long, it's longer term, it's interactive because you can work with your students or your colleagues, and it's very suited to your own specific needs in your own teaching context. We'll move on again. So this is what I think about action research. This is my take on it, if you like. that it's self-reflective, it allows us to be self-reflective and systematic. And we can take a kind of a critical, and by that I don't mean a negative approach, I mean a thoughtful approach to inquiry by people who at the same time were members of the research community. So the idea is to identify a situation that you think is not going quite as smoothly as you'd like it to see, or something that you consider to be worthy of investigation, to bring about some changes in practice. And it's, as I've said before, I think it's underpinned by democratic principles, because the ownership of the change is invested in us as the teachers who conduct the research. So this is something that I wrote quite a long time ago, but I think it's still relevant to my thinking today. Okay, let's move on. So I want to introduce you to some of the teachers that I've worked with in Australia, and to give you a few examples of action research on speaking that some of these teachers have done. I've been very, very lucky, because for the last 12 years, I've been involved with groups of teachers from all over Australia, the whole country. And these teachers have been involved in a program, a sponsored program through English Australia and Cambridge English, and it's called the Action Research in ELICOS program. ELICOS is a very, it's a long term, it means English Language Intensive Courses for Overseas Students. So it's ELICOS is a national program in Australia, and it's for teachers who are teaching international students who come into the country. So many of these teachers are working in language centres, for example, in universities or colleges, and providing programs which will support students coming into the Australian educational system, including people who might be doing IELTS tests, which a lot of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. So it's a range of teachers who've worked in these programs, and it's been really my privilege to work with them. As I said, this has been happening for 12 years, and I've learned a lot from the program. So I want to share with you just some of the examples of some of these teachers, and I hope that some of what I say, even though it's in the Australian context, with teachers working with a particular group of students, like international students, some of it may give you some ideas for your own classroom. So let's have a look at some of these examples. I'll just tell you a little bit about the program. So what happens is the teachers they come to an introductory workshop, which I do with them for 2 days. Talking about the kinds of things I'm talking about now, but at much greater length. And then the teachers go back to their classrooms and they begin their projects in their own classrooms on their topics that they've chosen. Then we have another workshop where everybody comes together again, and there's very, very, very excellent discussion about what the teachers have been doing, what kind of actions they've been putting into place in their classroom, what kind of evidence they've been collecting, the reflections that they've had, and so on. And this then leads on to going back again to their classrooms and continuing their research. And then when they come to workshop 3, that's when we wrap up the project. So by that time, they will have had about 7 to 9 months to do the research, and they will be ready to finish things off for that particular piece of work that they've been doing. And at that workshop, it's usually held in just before they give presentations on their research. And English Australia, the organisation that I've worked with, has a conference where the teachers are able to do presentations on the action research that they've done, and also to publish their work. So they always write about it, and it's published in a journal every year. So all the teachers get to present their research, but also write about their research. And then in the meantime, when the teachers are back in their classrooms and not at the workshops, we keep in touch in different ways. And over the years, we've tried different ways of communicating through a wiki, first of all, and then Facebook, and also WhatsApp more recently, to keep everybody in touch with each other in the group that are doing the research together. We've used Skype and Zoom, and of course, a lot of Zoom in the last 2 years. When we had the pandemic, we weren't always able to come together to have workshops face to face. So we were having to use a lot more technology and email contact as well. So that'll give you an idea of what happens to those teachers across the projects and the opportunities that they have to do the research. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to introduce you to some of the teachers. So this is Coral. She was one of the early teachers who worked with me. And on the next slide, I'll describe a little bit about her situation. So she was working in a language college in South Australia, and she had a lot of students from China, a mixed nationality group of students who were coming to study in Australia. And you can see the level was quite high. On the Common European Framework. And it was an academic course for university preparation. Some students were there for 40 weeks, others 25, and they wanted to prepare for undergraduate or postgraduate study. And the focus of Coral's research was on teaching listening and speaking, so that when the students got into their academic classrooms, they were able to participate more effectively. So let's have a look at what she did in her research. So you can see at the top there on the left-hand side, she started off in the first workshop by telling us about this. She said a case study she did with her students showed that outside the classroom, they were only spending a very small amount of time speaking English. So even though they were in a country where English was being spoken, they weren't using a lot of opportunities to speak English. That might have been through perhaps, you know, they were a bit fearful of speaking to English speakers, or they weren't used to it, or they didn't feel confident. There could have been a lot of reasons why that was happening. So she started thinking about whether listening was going to help her students tune in more to speaking activities, and whether she could give them some listening activities to prepare them for speaking. So this is what she did. She selected, you can see the question that she had at the top, authentic listening and speaking practice, to introduce that to her students. So she selected a range of podcasts for authentic listening, and she really wanted the students to be able to hear natural listening, conversations and presentations. And she asked her students to listen outside the class to these podcasts and to email 5 questions to her. And then she gave them feedback on the questions, and she used the questions for discussion inside the classroom and quizzes and debates. She got feedback from the students as well by asking them to rate how difficult they found the listening. And when they told her this in the feedback, she then used that information to get other podcasts that she could send to the students, because sometimes the students found them too difficult. So then she looked for ones which were not quite so complicated and might be easier to understand. Then she monitored their performance as well through recordings and classroom activities. She observed them and she interviewed some of the students. And the students, this process was quite, took some time, but over that time, the students eventually reported that listening became easier for them because they were getting a lot of listening outside the classroom and beginning to understand that the more listening that they did, the more they were able to prepare for the seminars that they would have to go to at the university and then be able to discuss them. Okay, let's have a look at another example. That may be something that you can take up and use, I'm not sure. So this is Brendan. He was in one of the next groups that worked with me. Let's let's have a look at what Brendan did and what situation. His situation was quite similar. He was working in a language college in Western Australia, and he had quite a mixed nationality class. And you can see where the students came from. Similar level, but he was teaching a general English course this time. It wasn't for university preparation particularly. And the problem for Brendan was that the college where he worked had what was called rolling enrollment. So every week, new students came into the class, and those students stayed either for a very short time, like only 1 or 2 weeks, or they stayed for up to 10 weeks. So his classroom was extremely difficult to manage because of the change of students that was happening. They had very diverse learning goals as well. So his focus was on teaching pronunciation, which is an interest of his in the speaking area. Let's have a look at what Brendan did too. So let's move on. Next slide. So this is what Brendan believed, and you can see at the top on the left, he said pronunciation is often neglected. And I think he's got a point there, because it's not always the case that as teachers we will focus on pronunciation to help the students become more comprehensible. So he said it's often neglected, yet it makes a huge difference in the confidence and communicative ability and motivation of the students. And I think that that is a good point that perhaps we can think about in a speaking classroom. So his question was how students could be encouraged to become more aware of their own pronunciation difficulties so that they could work on them. And he wanted them to gain a bit of independence and autonomy as well in the way that they were approaching their pronunciation issues. So what he did was this in his research. He looked at students' previous experiences he asked them about whether they had previously had any pronunciation instruction. And the answer was that they'd had very, very little. So the students had not really experienced much focus on their pronunciation. And he did a survey to ask them about that. Then he did a self-assessment. He got them to do a self-assessment of their own skills. And I mentioned before the segmental and super-segmental skills. And he used a needs analysis checklist. So he got the students to identify for themselves what their needs were in those two areas. And then he played them some recordings of native and non-native speakers to see how well they could comprehend these different speakers. And the interesting point was that the students concluded that being a native speaker did not necessarily make you easier to understand. So that reassured them that having an accent of their own was not necessarily something which would prevent them from being good communicators and good speakers. And the students then recorded themselves speaking and self-analyzed their difficulties as they saw them. They listened to their own recordings and identified what they thought were problems or areas that were challenging them in their pronunciation. And Brendan then gave the students quite a lot of different kinds of pronunciation activities, and he tried to adapt or present those activities in order to meet their needs. They were ones that he tried to select for the students to help them to learn more. And then they were recorded again at the end of his research, and they completed a further survey. And there was really a noticeable difference in the two recordings of the students. Brendan actually played some of the recordings for us in one of the workshops, and we could see a huge difference in the way that the students were pronouncing in speaking from the beginning and the end. It was really, really quite amazing. So he was very pleased by this research that he had done, and so were the students. Okay, let's go to the last example that I'm going to give you for today, and then we'll be finishing soon after that. So this is the third example, and these are Diana and Alla. They come from the University of Tasmania, and they were teaching in what's called a direct entry program. So when students complete that 15-week program at their university, they can then go, that qualifies them to go into the university course. If they pass all the assessments in that program, they're then able to enter their undergraduate or postgraduate courses. There were 16 students and 2 teachers, and there was mixed nationality. And Diana and Alla were concerned because they felt that in the courses that had been developed at their university, there was not enough emphasis on structured speaking activity. And in fact, there wasn't much attention paid to the students speaking at all. So they wanted to improve that if they could. And I'll show you what happened on the next slide. So this is what they said. Most of the students were worried about speaking in their future university classes. Our main focus was increasing their confidence and also enhancing learner autonomy through self-assessment. They wanted to encourage the students to self-assess themselves more, so that that would lead to greater learner autonomy. So their question was, how can we include self-assessment in existing speaking tasks to increase learner autonomy? So this is what they did in their research. The students completed a formative assessment task in the form of a tutorial discussion. So they had an assessment task that the teachers gave them in weeks 3 and 8 and 12. And then they were asked to do an initial self-analysis of their speaking and to set their own goals. And they continued to do this after each assessment task. So the teachers were pushing them to think more about what they themselves could analyze and what goals they could set for themselves as learners. And from week 5 to 15, they did speaking tasks and logs. Lots of tasks were designed from the student input. So the students themselves spoke with the teachers about the kind of things that they were interested in using in speaking. So it was things like short conversations with people from outside the classroom, and self-recordings and English only. And then the teachers analysed the students' recordings and the logs and the questionnaires. And so that was the evidence that they were looking for in their own research. And at the end of it all, the students indicated that they found the conversation tasks very useful. They also liked the self-recording, and they found that really valuable for their own speaking development. Okay, so can we move on to the next slide, please? So I think there are some really interesting areas that we can explore through on speaking, or Oracy, if I want to use that term. So I think these are some really interesting areas that anybody could explore if they want to try out action research. And some of you might be inspired after today's session to look at doing some research yourself. So I think these are my sort of hot tips, if you like, about topics that you could look at. So one is pronunciation, segmental or suprasegmental level. And the focus, I think, here should be intelligibility and comprehensibility. So not native speakerness. I think in English language teaching, we've had a big focus on students needing to sound like native speakers. And in today's world, where English is really a global language, this is not nearly as important as being able to communicate effectively with other people who also speak English. So being intelligible and comprehensible is far more important than aiming for some unattainable goal. And then scaffolding discourse and grammatical knowledge and skills in the typical spoken genre. So I think we can help our students with understanding typical genres, which I spoke about earlier, and helping them to scaffold their knowledge and skills by perhaps using models, getting them to develop the skills needed to achieve those models and practicing similar kinds of genres themselves. And then facilitating formative feedback in speaking. I think that that's a very important role for us as teachers. How can we do that? How can we give the students the kind of formative feedback which will help them to develop further? So formative meaning feeding forward into their future development in order to help them improve their speaking skills. And can we do that through things like student self-assessment or student peer assessment or teacher feedback, or a combination of all of those things to see which ones work more effectively? And developing the cognitive and metacognitive skills I spoke about earlier, for example, helping students to think about fluency and what increases their fluency, and also what planning strategies or pre-planning strategies they could be thinking about for helping them to speak more fluently and accurately. And then finally, I think one area which I feel is quite important in speaking development is looking and investigating the emotional and psychological factors in speaking development, because learning a language and speaking it is not just a matter of acquiring skills or knowledge. It also has an important psychological aspect where there are emotional aspects to being able to speak in another language and being able to use that language in culturally appropriate ways and rather quickly. So I think I've come to my very last slide, just some areas to help you think about. And it may be, I want to thank you for listening to me. I've gone a little bit over time, I think, but thank you for your patience. And if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to the presentation.
Thank you so much for this super insightful, informative, and inspiring session, Professor Anne Burns. It has been a pleasure to have you at Teacher Development Webinars. And I know when deciding which platform to present on, you have been very choosy about choosing the platforms, and you don't, present so often. But yeah, so for Teacher Development Webinars, it has been a pleasure to host you. And I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and all these experiences of action research, Oracy, and echoing all those teachers' voices. I really appreciate that. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for your comments. And for the comments in the chat too. Thank you very much. I appreciate them a lot.
Yeah, the chat is full of appreciation and comments. Dr. Ghulam Ali Bro says that this webinar will greatly help us teachers direct their teaching speaking skills effort on an appropriate and effective path. I second you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
So the floor is open for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And William Henderson, he's from Karachi, a colleague of mine, said, do you recommend any reflection tool?
Yeah, I suppose it depends whether you're talking about student reflection tools or reflection tools for action research. So let me talk about student reflection tools first of all. I think technology is really enabling a lot of ways that we can get students' reflections. I know some of the teachers I've been working with, they've been using different kinds of activities through technology, but then getting the students to reflect on the use of those tools. Either through the tool itself, which allows for some kind of reflection at the end, or separately through things like student journals or student feedback reflections after the individual activities, which ask the students to think about what was difficult, what they feel they achieved, where they think they need to go next to develop. Those kinds of questions can be extremely useful and important. So that's to get students to reflect. Also, of course, they can do it individually, or they could do it with a buddy or peer to reflect through some sort of peer reflection process, and it depends on your students and what you think would be effective and appropriate for your particular students. If it's to do with reflection on your action research, then I think again it's very useful for a researcher to have a reflective journal. And there are different things you can do. So you can do sort of factual reflection, which is to do with recording in a rather factual way what you observe happening without any evaluation of it, just to document it and notice it and look at what's happening in a rather self-conscious kind of way and make notes on that. Or you can do a more evaluative kind of reflection where you can evaluate your own performance. You can think about what went well in the lesson, how you would change it, how you would improve it, what you feel didn't go so well for the students, and you can also get student feedback, which can help you develop your own reflections even further. So I think those are it's a sort of introspective thing where you think of ways to record your own observations and also your own thoughts about how the activities have been. So I'll leave it at that because it's, obviously there's lots of other ways, but people may have more questions too.
Yes. So there's a question from Ratna, and she asked regarding teaching and speaking that you explained earlier, how to integrate the 7 stages in teaching speaking into the iterative process. Are the 4 cycles of action research?
Yes. Well, I think it should be a question of planning to introduce that cycle, and then using the cycle to try out the activities in the classroom in the way that I described before, those different steps, and also to then see whether that's really helping the students or whether there's something in the cycle which isn't working so well for your students. I mean, that cycle is it's a sort of general template or plan. And I always firmly believe that because teachers teach in many different classrooms, different students, different contexts, different syllabus, different textbooks, that we can still, modify that kind of cycle. So it may be that you want to have more rehearsal, for example, of the tasks. You may want the students to repeat more often, or you may want to have more reflection at each stage of the cycle from yourself and from the students. So I think it's a question of trying that cycle out and seeing what happens, and then documenting, collecting evidence about whether it's working or not. So I think that's the best way I can describe about integrating it with action research, and without being able to really be specific about all the different classrooms that people may be in who are listening to the webinar. I hope that helps anyway.
Thanks very much. A question about speaking anxiety. Someone asked, is speaking anxiety more trait specific or situation specific in nature?
Sorry, speaking and writing more.
Speaking anxiety. Yes, he says, is speaking anxiety more trait specific or situation specific in nature?
More specific?
Yeah.
I think all the language skills have some specific aspects to them that we can teach. I was very lucky to edit a book not too long ago with a former PhD student of mine, actually, Joseph Siegel, and we talked about the 4 skills. And each of those 4 skills has really got specific aspects that we think need teaching. The book is called International Perspectives on Teaching the 4 Skills. And, there are relationships between the skills. So speaking has its own skills that we need to develop with the students. Writing has, obviously, it's still language, and we might need to focus on things like genres or discourse and grammar and so on. But we don't need to focus in writing with students on the pronunciation, for example. So, there are different skills involved, But I think I would mention also that a lot of this, the 4 skills, they can lend themselves to combinations. So you may want the students to talk about something first of all, and then they may want to write about it. So you can use the same topic, but teach the skills in different ways for those same topic, and that would help the students to develop in both of those language skills in different ways. Thank you.
Yes, a question from Naz from Iraq, and she asked, what is the role of scaffolding instruction in developing oral skills?
I'm not getting the role of
Scaffolding.
Scaffolding.
Yep.
Okay. I think scaffolding is a really important concept for teachers. What it's to do with is not just handing over the responsibility for producing something to the students, but to help them to break that down into manageable parts of learning that they can then do better on their own. So built into our cycle, the speaking cycle that I told you earlier on, is the notion of scaffolding. In other words, you start preparing the students. So you don't throw them in at the deep end to just do the task. So if you remember in the first part of my cycle, there was a preparation part and introducing the students to the topic, asking them if they'd had any previous experiences of them, brainstorming, if you like, about what they already know about that topic so that you're getting a sense of what they still need to learn. And then doing the, letting them perform the task. And that gives you a sense of, okay, I really need to observe here how they're reacting to it. What's happening? Are they very competent? Can they do it really easily? Or are there some difficulties that I, as the teacher, can scaffold for them so that I can help them do it more effectively? And then giving them a chance to rehearse the tasks more than once so that gives them the opportunity to practice and to develop the skills further, is also, I think, a very important aspect of scaffolding. But none of these things are going to happen on their own unless the teacher creates the opportunities for them to occur in the classroom. So that's where scaffolding comes in, thinking really, really carefully about what your role is as a teacher that can help the students get to where you want them to get to, and not just assuming that they're just not competent in doing the task. It's a bit like small children having to learn to talk. They're not going to do that unless their parents or their guardians help them to talk. And we're teachers, you know, we're people who are helping others to learn to get there by giving them assistance along the way. And to me, that's what scaffolding is essentially about.
And that was so profound. And thanks for saying that. And we have next question from Carlos from Peru, and he asks, how can we develop oral skills in virtual classes?
You'll have to repeat, sorry.
So he's talking about how to develop oral skills in virtual classes.
For all 4 skills?
Oral skills are Oracy in virtual classes.
In business?
Virtual online classes.
Oh, sorry, virtual, yeah, virtual classes, okay. Yes, this is a really, you know, we've been really challenged, haven't we, over the last couple of years with this very topic, and I think it's been extremely, extremely interesting. And I think this is where the emotional and psychological part comes in really strongly for a lot of students, because sometimes they want to hide behind a Zoom camera and not, or whatever virtual platform you're using. They don't really want to be seen. But I think we have to, again, create the scaffolding, if you like, or the atmosphere, or the general expectations that we have about how they're going to participate in those sessions. I'm very, very strongly convinced that there shouldn't be surprises for people when they're in a classroom context, even if it's a virtual classroom context. So as teachers, you know, we can have the conversation right from the beginning about what we're expecting the students to do in the virtual space. And to set out very explicitly and discuss with the students that they will be expected to be on camera if that's what you want them to be, or they'll be expected to mute when they're not participating, or they will be expected to do the tasks publicly in front of other students, or we have expectations that they will go into the breakout rooms and complete the tasks, and we will monitor those. So, you know, I think having those sort of upfront expectations is quite important. And then also getting the students to perhaps give each other feedback. If you can have peer feedback, it's a very, very valuable thing, I think. And also encouraging them to self-evaluate in some of the ways that I was talking about before. I don't have all the answers. It's a complex area. And certainly, you know, the teachers that I've been working with over the last couple of years, they've been experimenting too with how they can do this best in the classroom. But I think some of these things that I've suggested have worked quite well for those teachers when they've been setting up the tasks for the students. And I'll leave it at that in case there are other questions. Hopefully it's helpful. Okay. Okay, so it seems that there are no other questions. I can't hear any more. So maybe we can round off the session now. I think our host might have disappeared. It's been wonderful I can see the names coming up. Thank you so much for your appreciation. That's really great. And I'm sure the organizers will talk to you about certificates. I don't do that myself, but I think what I might do is to say goodbye to everybody and thank you very much for coming to the session. It's been really wonderful, and good luck with your teaching. Yeah. Okay. Somebody's asking me about advice about action research. Hopefully I've already been talking about that, and I have several publications on that topic too that you might want to have a look at, and books on action research. So hopefully those will be helpful for you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And good luck and all the best with your teaching of speaking. Thank you. Bye-bye.